All right, it's me again. Don't know if I'll be able to do this for every form, but just as I read the form questions and before you get started answering the forms, hopefully if you get a chance to listen to these videos, it will help. This particular form in Unit 2 has to do with the importance of historical and cultural context, basically. And again, I was taught in seminary and Bible college that when it comes to interpreting Scripture, you ask, what does it mean? What did it mean to the people who first heard it? And then what does it mean today? And that's a pretty good rule of thumb. It may be a little more detailed than that now, a little more complex, but that's still a good rule of thumb. But it is important when you read a passage of Scripture that you do your best to study and put it in a historical context of what was going on that day, as well as some cultural things that you may be aware of or may not, because it can change the meaning of a passage of Scripture, or at least application from it. I'm not going to use the passage in John 5 that you're going to do, but I'm going to give you another example of how looking at something, a piece of a passage of Scripture, but in its historical and cultural context, may shed new light on applications. And the passage I've chosen is Matthew chapter 5, mainly verse 13, but the passage itself goes through verse 16. It has to do when Jesus said that we're to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And both salt and light change their environment, right? Both salt and light attack something, which sometimes is overlooked in its context. Light, obviously, the darker the darkness, even the small amount of light can change things. In some ways, the darker the darkness, the brighter the light, even a small amount of light. But I really want to emphasize or go back to this idea of salt, because oftentimes when you hear people talk about the salt and they say you're the salt of the earth, they immediately jump to the application of salt preserves, salt stops the spread of corruption, and those kind of things, and those things are true, and that is application, and that is a way of looking at that. But I think there's more that Jesus is saying in here when you put it into its context. First of all, in Jesus' day, salt was a valuable commodity. It was not salt like we have, table salt. That is really just a chemical compound, but this would have been sea salt, natural salt. You could go down and get it, and we still have that today, but we don't use that kind of salt a whole lot. And so being close to the Dead Sea, you would have this salt, and lots of it, and quantities of salt. And you're the salt of the earth. But in its context, salt being an extremely valuable commodity, it was also used as a military weapon. Oftentimes, the value of salt was so valuable that Roman soldiers were paid in salt. And that's really the etymology of our word salary, being paid in salt. And so in Jesus' day and in ancient days, an army would take salt and spread it over the fields of its enemy to kill the crops of its enemies. And not only would it kill the crops, but if you put enough salt on it, it would kill the crops, and also it would make it where, at least for a time being, the field, the soil would not be good to grow anything at all for a while. And so you could do major damage to your enemy by using salt. And then when the salt had lost its saltiness, the armies would collect that salt so it didn't dissolve like our salt. So they would collect that salt and then use it as gravel, basically, on roads and pathways. And so that's the idea of, if the salt loses its saltiness, then how can it be made salty again? And it's good for nothing but to be thrown under the feet of man and be trampled on. And so if you look at it from that perspective, historically, that salt is an incredibly valuable commodity, and salt was meant to be an offensive weapon. And then if you go further into Matthew's gospel, in Matthew 16, where Jesus tells his disciples, or he asks them, who do you say I am? And he enters into that conversation with the disciples about who people say Jesus is. And then Jesus says, who do you say I am? And then Peter answers, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says, based on that confession of faith, the confession of faith that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so Jesus wants us as his children, as his church, to be on the move, to be attacking the works of the enemy, to be attacking the very gates of hell, with the promise that if we attack the gates of hell, we will overcome. Now, if you look at it through that lens and the importance of salt of being a military weapon, and an offensive weapon, then you come back to Matthew chapter 5. Oftentimes when we interpret salt as being preserving or stops the spread of corruption, that's playing defense, so to speak, when Jesus wants us, the church, to be on the offensive. And so to be the salt of the earth may very well mean that as his people, as his churches, we are to attack the fields of the enemy and put salt on the fields to destroy its crop and to keep it from growing anything else. In other words, when the church moves into a community, things should be different. There should be no more room in that community for Satan's crop to grow. And so, we need to move into the community, and in our community, in our communities as churches, we need to fight back against the enemy, plant that salt, take our street back. So there should be, no drug dealers, helping people overcome their opioid crisis, fighting for affordable housing, fighting for livable wages, fighting for all these things that affect our communities in a negative way, and it actually becomes crop of the enemy. Maybe, just maybe, by being salt of the earth, what Jesus is saying is we should go on the attack and change the culture around us by destroying the works of the enemy. Just something to think about when you put a passage of Scripture in its historical and cultural context. Thanks.